Julius Caesar was not a man. It's quite common to hear in queer circles that gay people have always been here. Gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender men and women have always existed for thousands of years. This message appears on social media posts, on websites, in books, TV shows, and of course, on YouTube.
Trans people are not a new thing.
Trans people are not new.
All throughout human history and all over the world, people have been people for as long as that's been a meaningful concept.
Gender variance is older than you think.
Individuals have been seeking ways to change their gender forever.
Non-binary, gender non-conforming, transgender people, there are so many different words for them, and there have been for literally not hundreds, but thousands of years.
There is ironclad proof, as ironclad as we can get for as far back as we're going, that there were transgender people existing at least 2,400 years ago.
The Roman Emperor Trajan was also openly gay.
A common thread that unites all these different works is referencing classical antiquity, the art and aesthetics of ancient Greece and Rome. As a queer anthropologist myself, I'm kind of interested in this. With how homophobic the pre-Stonewall period is often depicted in queer retellings of their own history, why are queer people drawn to find themselves in the ancient past? Over the course of this video, I'm going to be looking into queer people's interest in antiquity through two lenses, or paradigms. In the first, I'll explain the phenomenon using the concept of hegemony, and in the second, I'll combine different positions from different anthropologists and historians that focused on emic gender studies, or studying gender from an insider's point of view. Then, to add on to this conversation, I'll offer a different way of viewing the ancient past, following in the footsteps of authors from the second paradigm. When anthropologists talk about something being hegemonic, what they mean is that an idea has become normalized or taken for granted to be fact. The 20th century philosophers Pierre Bourdieu and Antonio Gramsci wrote a lot about hegemony. Something interesting that they mentioned is how normalcy is created by constantly defining it. In a way, those who are able to repeat an idea or belief over and over again make it normal, and in a way make it true. In other words, hegemonies are created through repetition. One of the ways hegemonies are established is through the appropriation of symbols. In the United States, classical symbols are powerful and have an air of authority to them. Just look around. We model our federal buildings off of Roman monumental architecture. Americans put a president in a Greek temple and slapped a big Egyptian obelisk right outside the building where all the laws are written. Emblazoned on the floor of the Oval Office is an eagle modeled after a Roman aquila. America's national motto, E pluribus unum, is in Latin. Heck, even the national anthem was based on a drinking song about Zeus getting jealous of a Greek poet.
To Anacreon in heaven, where he sat in full glee.
Very powerful people are often surrounded with Greek and Roman art. It's a sign of sophistication, of wealth, the aristocracy, education. Classical antiquity is the language of power. And the desire to attain that high status and to attain that power has deep roots within the American queer community.
I'd always see the way the rich people lived, and I'd feel it more, It would slap me in the face. I'd say I'd have to have that because I never felt comfortable being poor. I just don't.
The balls to us is as close to reality as we're going to get to all of that fame and fortune and stardom and spotlight.
Those balls are more or less like our fantasy of being a superstar. A lot of those kids that are in the balls, they don't have two of nothing. Some of them don't even eat. They come to balls starving, and they sleep in under 21, or they sleep on the pier, or wherever. They don't have a home to go to, but they'll go out and they'll steal something and get dressed up and come to a ball for that one night and live the fantasy.
You can become anything and do anything right here, right now, and won't be questioned. I came, I saw, I conquered. That's a ball.
So, the thing is because classicism is the language of power and are associated with wealth and status, it's alluring for queer people, a marginalized community. By adopting classicism and seeing ourselves in the ancient past, we are saying to ourselves that all that power and status and importance, all that attention is actually focused onto us. And through repeating this through various genres, queerness becomes historical. Their presence becomes taken for granted. and in other words, queerness becomes hegemonic. In other words, the framework of hegemony can explain why queer people may be drawn to find themselves in the ancient past. Repeating such a story makes queerness normal, and it can give queer people a sense of power given the gravitas that antiquity has. However, is this view of history really accurate? What do queer people miss out on when they accept this story as fact? I'm filming in a closet right now, so let's see how this goes. So throughout the 90s and 2000s, it was popular in anthropology to look at cultures and see a quote-unquote third gender in other societies. Generally speaking, beforehand, anthropologists assumed that males and females pretty much acted the same across all societies. But then, around this time period, people began to question those assumptions, saying, hey, look, there's a bunch of societies that have genders that are beyond a binary. These people are third gender, they're transgender, they're non-binary, stuff like that. And queer people have since ran with this idea and said, hey, all those genders are actually us. We have always been here. However, in recent years, this idea has gotten pushed back by anthropologists and historians. I'm talking people like Michael Power, Evan Trowell, Lynn Morgan, Evan Bleiberg, Paige West, Rosemary Joyce, Amy Richelin. They've all said that putting labels like third gender and non-binary or transgender onto cultures that don't have those terms and they use different things gets in the way of our understanding. And instead, we should try to meet cultures where they're at and understand them on their own terms instead of trying to shoehorn them into a box that we created for them.
It is important that when Western, especially white people investigate gender outside their own cultures, respect the nuances and differences in gender between each individual, cultures and communities, and not categorize everyone who does not fit our expectations as transgender or non-binary or queer.
This is all well and good, but the standard isn't evenly applied. Usually this carefulness towards using gender terms to describe other cultures really applies to people in the gender community. At worst, removing queer people from antiquity delegitimizes them. It says that they don't really have a history, and that they're a recent thing. In a time when queer people face legislation and outlining their existence from public life, this kind of erasure can be alarming. The kicker is that this similar level of scrutiny isn't applied to straight people. If we were to really apply this idea and go the full 9 yards with it, we would have to question if other cultures had men and women at all. Strange, I know, but hear me out. For example, a variant of the We Have Always Been Here narrative about trans people focuses on the idea that trans people lived in the Roman Empire. Specifically, there was this group of priests called the Galli who are said to have castrated themselves and dressed like a different gender and stuff like that. There are some historians like Sophie Edwards and Timothy Taylor who claim that there were methods available in Imperial Rome that people like the Galli could have taken to hormonally transition by drinking the urine from pregnant horses. However, this idea has been criticized by some historians like Spencer McDaniel, who say that drinking pregnant mare urine, while certainly possible, lacks any definite evidence that people were doing that to become like the other sex. That said, if we were to apply the same logic evenly, we would have to say that men didn't exist in ancient Rome. What makes me say this? Consider the fact that in America, a lot of our ideals of what makes a male a man and a female a woman is very culturally based. I mean, we could go back to the 1950s to the development of the nuclear family and the consumerism of the 20th century, and we can trace back how these ideals and symbols of manhood got defined. Being a man has a history to it. While many Americans may define the differences between gender in regards to their sex, this pairing is kind of arbitrary and hasn't always been the case. You could easily just define gender based on something like temperature and moisture. Men are hot and dry, while women are cold and wet. In fact, this is how ancient doctors like Hippocrates have defined it for centuries. And so if we were to look at ancient Rome and what their words for males were, I'm talking about sex here, we find that Romans didn't really talk about men and women. After all, these are English words. They talked about viri and mulineres and mulebris and gnaiduli, categories which historians translate to be men and women, but on what grounds? If a Roman vir was defined by heat and dryness, while American men are not, how can we say that they're really the same, Do we lose context when we do? If we're to say that the Galli aren't trans because of a specific cultural circumstance, despite them dressing like women, acting like women, receiving essentially bottom surgery, and sharing a lot of similar features of trans women today, shouldn't we also say that viri weren't men based on a similar level of difference? And so, to Michael Power's point, while yes, trans people did not exist in the ancient past, straight people didn't either. Not in the ways we think of it today, at least. We have to realize that even terms like men and women exist within a gender system. Queerness defines what is manly and womanly just as much as men define women and women define men. Honestly, this view of things is helpful because we're able to look at the past and look at other cultures in a more nuanced perspective by speaking about them with their own terms.
Romans will see you partaking in the bacchanalian delights with your Rominos.
So overall, although the We Have Always Been Here narrative has a political goal to subvert a counter-narrative that says that trans people don't have a history, the way advocates get there is kind of inaccurate. It assumes that a specific type of gender presentation, in this case transgender and non-binary people, are a human universal.
All throughout human history and all over the world, people have been people for as long as that's been a meaningful concept.
Gender variance is older than you think, and trans people are part of that legacy.
This goes against the idea that gender is a social construct. Even a surface look into other cultures can show that not everybody thinks about gender the same. In fact, the We Have Always Been Here narrative produces the same kind of anachronisms that social conservatives make when they say that gender roles practiced today have always existed worldwide. Both make a general claim on what it means to be a particular gender. The past was neither straight nor gay, it was something else entirely.
It's Hegelian dialectics.
To recap, in this video I looked at the queer use of antiquity through the paradigms of hegemony and emic gender studies. Viewing queer antiquity through hegemony showed that the queer use of classicism is subversive and is aimed to normalize queerness. Viewing the phenomenon through emic gender sexuality studies offered a critique on the way that people go about this. I again question how accurate it really is to imagine contemporary genders existing in the ancient past, given how different their cultures were. Overall, I believe both paradigms are helpful in thinking about and talking about queer and ancient history. Now, is the point I raised without flaws? Certainly not. Gender, and the history of anthropological theory more generally, is very much like a ship of Theseus. Many parts come and go until the ship becomes unrecognizable. Attempting to pinpoint when exactly gender roles change is like asking which part of the ship changed the boat. Regardless, using the words that ancient peoples would have used to describe themselves is perhaps the most accurate way of referring to them. If that means that we should say that Julius Caesar wasn't a man, but the vir, and Caesar's pronouns were is, eus, so be it. But what do you think? Do you agree with the ways queer people talk about ancient history? Let me know down in the comments. I'd actually be really interested in hearing your thoughts. I'm probably going to make an addendum to this, a more long-form video, describing a little bit more of the points further in detail. But yeah, keep an eye on for that. Subscribe if you want to see it. But that's all for now.